Now, more worryingly, of course, deepfakes are also associated with non-consensually produced pornography, both of private individuals and celebrities. So two cases that occurred early in 2024 have been especially widely discussed. First, a young woman going by the pseudonym Jody found that her best friend at university had produced deepfake pornography of her and posted it to various websites. So this male perpetrator, who turned out to be one of the BBC Young Composers of the Year, confessed and was given a 20-week prison sentence, suspended for 2 years. Second, in January of this year, pornographic deepfakes of Taylor Swift went viral on Twitter. On the right here is one of the non-pornographic deepfakes of her with a septum piercing and smoking a cigarette, just to give you a sense of how realistic these images can be. So in terms of the moral harms that deepfakes might bring about, some of these are fairly obvious, like the production and circulation of non-consensual pornography. This is harassment, it's extremely degrading, may be very damaging to one's career, it's psychologically damaging to see oneself in a deepfake performing acts one would either not perform or at least not have others see one perform. Even though the deepfakes may not be believed, they can still create associations between a person and sexual activity that may be unwanted. And of course, Taylor Swift's deepfakes were seen by many young people on social media, and that counts as a harm too. Now, one domain that seems particularly vulnerable to deepfakes is democratic policies and procedures. So here's 3 imaginary examples for you. Suppose that you're running for candidacy in an election and a deepfake still image of you enthusiastically shaking hands with Nigel Farage surfaces. Or an audio deepfake circulates on Twitter that purports to be a recording of you on a night out, drunkenly shouting racial slurs. Or suppose a video deepfake of you appears on Facebook that purports to be a recording of you taking part in a protest at university, but which depicts you assaulting a police officer unprovoked. So clearly these 3 imaginary deepfakes would be harms to you as an electoral candidate. They'd be harms to your reputation. They might conceivably be used to blackmail you into standing down or rescinding your candidacy. They're also conceivably harm to voters. The point of creating and circulating deepfakes like these would be to hamper informed decision-making on the part of the electorate. They'd be an affront to the autonomy and agency of voters. But these are still moral harms we're talking about, and what's more, the harms to individuals. But there's a claim one encounters in the literature on deepfakes, whether that's the legal literature, political literature, philosophical literature, which is that deepfakes will damage democracy in and of itself. So this is quite an intuitive thought, and put simply, the idea is that electoral processes and procedures themselves are damaged by deepfakes, never mind the particular people involved. As I said, that claim is very widespread. It's also very intuitive. But I want to look at it a little bit closer, because there's some aspects of that claim that I think are worth questioning. So here's a potential puzzle. The moral harms posed by the technology are very clear and they're very present. Again, both private individuals and celebrities are being non-consensually deepfaked into pornographic images. And the 2 cases I mentioned involving Jody and Taylor Swift are just the tip of the iceberg. So the arrival of this technology has instantly caused significant moral harms in that respect, especially to women. By contrast, despite intense anxieties, intense hand-wringing about potential for this technology to harm democracy, examples of direct harms that deepfakes have caused for democratic procedures are conspicuous by their absence. Concrete examples of deepfakes having made a difference in an election context just aren't there. So the thought is here, look, if it's so bad for democracy, where is the proof? We've got the proof of its moral harms already. And so even back in 2020, scholars were worried about deepfakes in this respect. So this is a quote from an opinion piece written by a philosopher and a computer scientist from the University of Seattle. They say the personal harms that can be unleashed by deepfakes are limited only by the imaginations of bad actors, but they're dwarfed by the scale of societal harms we may soon experience. It's chilling to think of the effect they may have on the 2020 US presidential election. But what effects? Right? Deepfakes arguably played no significant role at all in the US 2020 election. Now, this is not to say that there have not been attempts to use deepfakes to manipulate voters in election contexts. There have. So on the right here, these are 2 images of Trump embracing Anthony Fauci. And these appeared in a 2023 television campaign advertisement by the Republican Ron DeSantis. And Fauci, who's basically, I'm sure you all know, Chris Whitty's equivalent in the US, is a controversial figure in the eyes of many Republican Party supporters. So these images represent a clear attempt at using deepfakes to sway political opinion by discrediting a political opponent in the eyes of voters. But what's notable, however, is how little effect the image had. So I'm sure some of you know as well, half a year after the advertisement was broadcast, DeSantis suspended his campaign and endorsed Trump. So DeSantis using a deepfake to discredit Trump was plainly unsuccessful. So this is the puzzle. Intuitively, this technology has a great potential to disrupt electoral processes, but then why haven't they? And so the hypothesis that I want to kind of float and think about is this. The current political climate, call it post-truth climate, whatever label you like to give it, is sufficiently hostile to truth already that deepfakes can just make little difference here. And the way I like to think about this is with an analogy. So one way we can think about deepfakes is that they're the equivalent of a single barrel of crude oil spilled into an already vast oil slick. They're a harmful pollutant in themselves, granted, but given the state of the environment into which they've been introduced, they're one that will just have very little effect. Simply put, the thought is that democracy is in a poor enough state around the world, many parts of the world already truth-wise, that deepfakes will make scant difference. They're just one more truth-unfriendly factor amongst a much larger truth-hostile morass. So what do I mean by current political climate? Pretty much what you might imagine I mean. It's no news to anyone here that the political domain is often characterized by its unfriendliness to truth. Politicians are not infrequently economic with truth. They spin, that is, they attempt to distract from truth. Sometimes they just tell broad-based lies. Sometimes they're what a philosopher, Qasim Qasim, has usefully called recently epistemically insouciant. That is, they just don't care either way for truth or falsity, and they simply bullshit their way through the day. Qasim thinks that Gove and Johnson are prime examples of epistemically insouciant politicians. They just don't care enough about truth in the first place to attempt to undermine it with lies. They just kind of bumble their way through the day saying whatever they think will make them popular and attract votes. So what's important here is that voters are aware of these facts, I take it. Everything in the political domain is very often taken with a pinch of salt. And now, obviously, this isn't news to anyone listening, but I think it is important for understanding deepfakes and explaining why they fail to have much impact on democratic procedures, despite their seeming potential to. But also, I think it's important for acknowledging what might be the real threat that deepfakes pose for democracy. So this is sort of parting thought I want to leave you with. So it might be that the real threat deepfakes pose for democracy is that they'll put us in a very delicate kind of catch-22 situation regarding whether to reform post-truth politics to be more welcoming of credible and sincere speech. So suppose on the one hand that we don't reform post-truth politics, we leave things as they are, we accept the political domain as one where people not infrequently speak with little regard for truth. In that case, I think we've reason to believe deepfakes will continue to have little effect. There'll just be one more epistemic pollutant that will sort of blend into the background of noise and epistemic contamination that goes around in political speech and the political domain. But of course, in saying that, we'd be allowing democracy to stay epistemically polluted, which is not desirable in any domain, least of all one where acquiring accurate information matters for informed decision-making on the part of voters. So on the other hand, suppose we do reform post-truth politics, somehow we incentivize politicians toward credible and sincere public speech, somehow we disincentivize epistemic insouciance, somehow we come up with penalties for spin and outright lies, and we end up living what's for many the democratic dream. So I worry that in a sort of epistemically pristine political environment like that, we may get the ideal ground in which deepfakes can take root and wreak havoc. The thought is, if politicians become sincere speakers, if the whole political domain gets cleaned up, then deepfakes of them will likely be taken at face value. Any kind of information might likely be taken at face value in a cleaned up political area. So I can see that I'm running out of time, but that's the kind of headline, big picture thought that I wanted to leave you guys with. And thanks very much for that. Just to say, I don't think we can hear you in the room anymore, those of us online.
I muted up during your talk then, so that you didn't have any background noises. I'm going to share Precious's presentation now. Hopefully.
Okay, well, as you're getting it up, I will
Start talking, of course, yeah.
So it's quite hard to follow Dan's talk, which was very kind of relevant and kind of applied to everybody. Mine's a little bit more specific, so please forgive me, but I will try to make it as engaging as I can. It's about religious institutions as information actors, and essentially about what I would consider to be like the under-researched role that religious organisations play, specifically as actors that engage in information politics about things other than religion itself, and specifically about war and conflict. Now, basically, at times of crisis, information management of any type is essentially a priority, obviously never more so than during war. And so institutions with high levels of social trust are very well placed to wade into debates about what's true and false, what's right and wrong. And they essentially then be able to propagate a version of the truth about conflict, about its salience, about the history that led up to it, and therefore about who is at fault, or about, you know, what the right interpretation of a particular element of that conflict is. But often, if we sort of just reflexively think about religious institutions as information actors that talk about war and conflict, we tend to do it in relation to states. So are they on this state side or that state side? Or are they being influenced by the state, or are they influencing the state? And my argument today is that those are fundamentally the wrong questions to help us to understand the role that they play and the power that they have when it comes to talking about war and conflict. We need to think about religious organisations as information actors in their own right, because otherwise we can't understand the kind of power that they have in an overarching environment of information overload, where there's massive mistrust, whereas, as Dan said, you know, there's potentially this hostility to truth, and actually people's feelings and first impressions about issues and events are made more important than, but certainly as important as, their rational responses to those things. So we have to be able to understand those kind of interpretative elements if we want to know the power of religious organisations, basically. Can I have the next slide, please? So the case I'm talking about is this one. And this is a picture of the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, who is kind of very well known for peddling pro-Kremlin type disinformation about the war. And he has said previously, like in general, about values and about the war itself, but more generally about values and the way the world is going, that we are talking about something more important than politics, to be talking about human salvation. So for him, he's kind of linking very spiritual religious themes with political themes. I'll come back to that later.
Sorry, getting there. I apologize.
Okay, so I'm interested in Russia. That's what I do. Maybe you're not. So my next slide is just a little side question. Who cares anyway? Why should we even care that religious organisations might work as information actors in their own right? So I came up with 3 totally random global examples that might pique your interest of how religious organisations have had significant informational roles. The first is that in recent years, the administration of Marcos Jr. has come to power in the Philippines, essentially based on the back of a massive campaign of historical revisionism about the original Marcos martial law period, basically saying that was fine, you know, they did loads of infrastructural projects. And the Catholic Church in the Philippines came out and issued like an official letter basically decrying this historical revisionism. So they waded specifically into that debate about information and historical disinformation. The Epoch Times is an international paper produced by the Falun Gong movement from China. So essentially it has a kind of religious spiritual rationale, but it talks about various topics. And finally, we know that vaccine hesitancy and susceptibility to COVID disinformation were much higher amongst certain religious groups for various reasons. So it was high amongst evangelicals. We saw this in Brazil, in the USA as well, and also in general with groups with sort of high distrust of establishment institutions on a religious basis, including, say, the Rastafari community in St. Lucia. So we know that religious organisations can kind of feed into what we believe to be true about things far beyond religion all over the world. So to go back to the case that I'm interested in, how can we know what we know about religious organisations and how they influence people? So the key topic for me is soft power, which has been described as simultaneously ubiquitous and unclear, quite unhelpful. So it's been identified as the crucial component by which religious organisations can exert an influence on politics, but it's kind of challenging to apply because there aren't brilliant conclusive definitions of exactly what soft power is and how it works. And also it can be tricky to operationalise this kind of broad concept about some sort of attractive power, you know, how that would work in practice. So to just kind of talk about how we might use it in a useful way. The next slide, please. First of all, soft power is something we can think of not as a resource that can just be wielded, but as something that's fundamentally relational. And this will come back up later on, because you might have, or a political actor might have a lot of soft power over a particular political actor and absolutely none over another. We'll come back to that with religion in a moment. It's also diffused rather than direct. Once something becomes too direct, it becomes much harder. And you can think about this in terms of, say, agenda setting. That can be done using very hard kind of restrictive techniques, or it can be done by promoting particular other narratives and stories. But obviously there's quite a grey area there, and it can be difficult to work out exactly where that line is crossed between kind of hard power techniques and soft power techniques. So it's been argued that part of the kind of crucial distinction is the target's perception that it's legitimate, that it's positive. If they believe that what's being said or done is kind of the legitimate means it's positive, then it counts as power, which brings me back to that question of emotion and of feelings, etc., etc. So strategic narratives have been put forward as one way we might operationalise the idea of soft power, and this means that the way that political actors construct a shared meaning of the past, present and future of international politics to shape the behaviour of domestic and international actors in ways that accord with their strategic goals. And these narratives might be about particular systems or issues, identities, but they don't necessarily have to be propagated by states themselves. So when we apply them to religious organisations, we can think about how those actors exert their own agency in accordance with their own strategic priorities and how that might affect what they say about things, including war and conflicts, and then what kind of power that has to influence other people's perceptions. So if we look at what's been said in Russia and Ukraine by religious actors about the war, the next one, please, yeah. Well, they come from kind of interestingly different starting points, even though you might assume there are some important similarities. So both Russia and Ukraine are notionally secular states, but with significant Orthodox majorities. Constitutionally, they are secular, but in fact, they're very different. So Russia's constitution places it as a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional state where there are four traditional religions that are institutionally prioritized. In fact, the Russian Orthodox Church has got de facto primacy. And part of this is related to a very important shared mythology of the origins of the state and the origins of the church, which are intimately interconnected. The idea that out of the medieval kingdom of Rus, to which Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia all trace their roots, there was this conversion to orthodoxy that fundamentally intertwined the state and those three nations, according to the Russian point of view, which I'll come back to later. And this has been kind of interwoven in various political iterations through history in Russia. So on one hand, the Orthodox Church in Russia was very intimately interwoven with the autocratic Tsarist state, the idea of manifest destiny, that Moscow was the third Rome. And so there's been very significant church-state collaboration, even when the USSR, which was notionally atheist, was going on. We had high-level collaboration from the Russian Orthodox Church and the state, kind of basically because they shared this conviction that the collective was considerably more important than the individual. The church never emerged as a challenger to the state, even in Soviet times, as it did in other countries. And neither of those institutions has any democratic experience whatsoever. So if you think back to the one time Russia had a chance to institute a democratic system. After the end of one dynasty, they basically got landowners together and democratically decided on who would be the new autocrat. So quite an interesting choice. Now, in Ukraine, the position is very different. So various indigenous religions are recognized in the Ukrainian constitution, including, for example, the Crimean Tatars, who are Muslim majority. In Ukraine, the kind of mythology around religion and the state has gone entirely in the opposite direction. And orthodoxy has been very much associated with independence, and again, because of geopolitical developments. So for a couple of hundred years, there was a nascent sort of democratic Ukrainian state established by the Cossacks on democratic military lines, in which orthodoxy was a component of that, and that was very much in opposition to the empires that dominated at the time, including the Russian Empire, which ultimately did subjugate the Cossack hetmanate. But nonetheless, orthodoxy there was associated with sovereignty, with agency. There is democratic experience, even in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Certain bishops were like democratically elected and then ratified back in the 14th century before it was overtaken by Moscow. So there is some sort of democratic experience in both politics and religion that means that those two become intertwined. There's some sort of mythology or meaning around that. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to say like what this means in practice. So this one, yeah. So what have they said about identity on the basis of these kind of philosophical thoughts? Well, first of all, the Russian Orthodox Church is fully on board with the idea that Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are part of one big triune greater Russian nation. They talk about the idea of a Russian world that brings together Russian-speaking and Russian ethnic peoples across the world as part of a civilizational and spiritual group, in which the church and the state can work together to achieve something greater than themselves and to basically confront the threat posed by external values that challenge these true spiritual values, including Western values. And they've managed to actually peg into other traditional values movements abroad doing that through essentially like it works like a state's diplomatic mission. They have their own sort of diplomatic arm, the Russian Orthodox Church, that does this. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine has kind of taken a completely different, more varied approach. So there are some who agree that there's shared heritage that might overcome linguistic bounds, but increasingly Ukrainian language and Orthodox independence have been identified as very important parts of Ukrainian identity. Senior Ukrainian Orthodox figures have said essentially the Russian world idea is fundamentally imperial. The Russian Orthodox Church is anti-Ukrainian and an instrument for hybrid aggression against Ukraine. That is a quote from the current head of the newly minted Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which I won't go into the whole thing about this, but this came up literally in 2009. It was founded essentially in response to fears of Russian influence in the Ukrainian Orthodox churches as a fully independent church. So can you spin on two slides ahead, please? So essentially, my conclusions are that religious organisations do operate as information actors in their own right, whether or not they might be saying things that go with the states that they are associated with or not. And they wield their own soft power in relation to their target groups, whether this is successful or, in the case of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine nowadays, increasingly not successful. And the sources of those soft power belong to those religious organisations themselves, related to their own history, their own development, and how that's worked with the societies that they're operating in. And it's those particular factors that make them believable or unbelievable information actors. So in the case of the Orthodox churches operating in Ukraine, their competing interpretations of the build up to the war, the factual interpretations of different parts of the war, are very much connected to those, their own overarching development and spiritual and historical.
So I'm going to talk about two research projects, the first of which addresses democracy, disinformation and religion. It's an OSD project that we're leading, and it's in part focused on the Philippines, a part of the world where I've got some expertise. And the other project addresses religious literacy and social justice with a focus on FE colleges in the Midlands. Both projects involve significant engagement with partners, including political activists, journalists, religious, artists, academics, instructors, administrators, and students in workshop settings, and both address the politics of our information-saturated world. They've sought to generate atmospheres by creating safe spaces for people to share sometimes troubling experiences, and mobilise practices of co-design in a pragmatic, hands-on spirit, trying to work up ideas that will enable different people publics to coalesce and reflect on interpretive strategies for becoming literate in an information-saturated world. I'm framing the reflective and collective dimensions of these projects in terms of literacy, but I'm using the word critically, about which more later. In what follows, I'll say a few words about each project in turn, and then I'll talk about literacy, religious literacy, and information and disinformation before concluding. So Precious and I saw the need for an OSC project on democracy, disinformation, and religion as we reflected in Precious's case on the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the sedimentation of particular tropes and narratives about Ukraine and the Ukraine war, and in mine on the role of the Catholic Church in the Philippines in trying to draw attention to political disinformation and to arrest its influence. And you've already alluded to the pastoral letter, The Truth Will Set You Free, which the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines issued on the anniversary of the EDSA uprising, which ousted the Marcos dictatorship in '86. Basically, what our project or what our different areas of expertise sort of bring to or highlight is a sort of double role of religion. On the one hand, a source of disinformation as an institutional apparatus for disseminating it, but also as a potential vehicle for information and media literacy. And that indicated to us a blind spot in contemporary approaches to information manipulation, which really acknowledge the articulation of religion and religious institutions with contemporary informational infrastructures. It also pointed to a blind spot in regard to knowledge exchange and information literacy initiatives, which have tended to ignore religious actors and their potential for agency. We had a 2-day workshop in London in January that brought together a range of partners to share experience and best practice. And we're currently in the middle of a competition that pairs cartoonists and academics as we explore the potential for cartoons to convey academic and political messages, and more broadly, the role art might play in information literacy as we take the project forward. The second project emerged from academic debates in religious studies, my discipline, if you like, around religious literacy. A useful point of departure for thinking about religious literacy, or one useful point, is the American Academy of Religion's guidelines for teaching about religion. And they define religious literacy as, quote, the ability to discern and analyze the intersections of religion with social, political, and cultural life, stating that in the USA, illiteracy regarding religion is widespread, and that this religious literacy, quote, fuels prejudice and antagonism. But that this prejudice and antagonism can be diminished by teaching about religion in schools using a non-devotional academic perspective called religious studies. The teaching of religions in British schools and universities has similarly seen itself as a vehicle for this kind of literacy. However, in recent years, there's been a lot of soul searching and questioning in the field. For example, as Barnes argues, current representations of religion in British religious education are limited in their capacity to challenge racism and religious intolerance, chiefly because they're conceptually ill-equipped to develop respect for difference. While according to Panjwani and Revel, representations of Islam in textbooks, examinations, and syllabi are essentialisms leading to stereotypes and unsubstantiated generalizations. This has led to a critical reappraisal of teaching in the field, culminating in the recommendations of the Religious Education Council Report 2018, which calls for the wholesale reform of the curriculum to better reflect the lived experience of pupils and students. My project with West Midlands FE colleges is part of that reform-minded wave in religious studies and presupposes the implication of religious literacy in prejudice and antagonism, and that prejudice and antagonism can be addressed through literacy initiatives. But why frame those debates around literacy? According to Harvey Graff, the literacy myth amounts to the assumption that literacy is a necessary precursor to, I quote, economic development, democratic practice, cognitive enhancement, and upward social mobility. The quote goes on with a few more sentences. But his basic argument is that you can't prove the benefits, or you can't measure the benefits of literacy. And while those benefits are difficult to specify or measure, nevertheless, the range and power of the institutions charged with developing them have nevertheless grown exponentially. So from his point of view, literacy might be regarded as a constraint on the development of progressive and or critical dispositions given its ideological implication in, say, from the 19th century, missionary activity, colonialism, modernity, disciplinary society, and more. Whatever literacy might be, it's not neutral and it's not value-free. When it comes to religious literacy, Wolfart argues that its assumptions are embedded in both in Christian theological ideas about truth and Enlightenment conceptions of religions as being something like languages that can be rendered mutually intelligible by acts of translation from one to the other by suitably qualified, that is, suitably literate experts. He notes an absence of research concerning illiteracy and its effects, and asks whether illiteracy really does engender violence and make people nasty, as the proponents of religious literacy seem to be arguing. And we can also note the tendency in responses to the REF to instrumentalise research outcomes into various forms of impact, for which literacy initiatives can be useful proxies, because they're straightforward to mobilise and document and can generate rich qualitative data. Certainly in religious studies today, religious literacy is all the rage, often built into a research project, operating as an unassuming automatic good that will magically generate beneficent effects. But what those effects precisely are and how they accrue remains, according to Wolfart, poorly tested. Well, I've got some sympathy with that critique, but not going to buy into it completely, because it feels to me a bit like a bit of bad faith to make that critique from within an institution that's charged with literacy and as someone who's been trained in a particular kind of literacy, to then say, draw up a drawbridge and say, well, I've got it, but you can't have it. So now I want to talk about literacy and information disinformation. So I want to think about literacy and religious literacy and information disinformation as related problems. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are not just examples of religious illiteracy. The dissemination of Islamophobic and anti-Semitic tropes are often also implicated in disseminated disinformational narratives. In fractious times like ours, indulging and sharing disinformation, conspiracy, and spite can feel like a way to stick it to the man. To return to the Philippines, Patricia Evangelista's powerful Some People Need Killing, a memoir of murder in the Philippines, where she documents former President Rodrigo Duterte's self-styled war on drugs, which according to some 27,000 people were murdered by police, death squads, and vigilantes. And among other things, painstakingly laid bare in her account is the manner in which police routinely lied to journalists, to the families of victims, and to the courts about the circumstances of their contact with those they killed. But another thing she documents is the regret among many who, for having voted for Duterte in the first place. That election campaign, like apparently all elections in the Philippines, was full of lots of disinformation. But in a way, Duterte made no secret of his intentions as he saw election, frequently stating that he would unleash death on drug users and pushers. Why did they vote for him, even as he told them, "Papatay, I will kill you"? Perhaps voting for Duterte was a means of sticking it to the Manila elite, whose grip on the political machinery of the country had hardly wavered since the ouster of Marcos in '86, but who delivered so very little of what was promised. Duterte seemed like someone who could shake things up and get things done. In common with elections elsewhere around the same time, in the sense that the election of Duterte was accompanied by an explosion of disinformation on social media seeking to influence voter behaviour. So if we're going to link, or if I want to link literacy and information, I also want to see them as intersected by actions and practices. On my last. And I found this really interesting little article about the Federation of Worker Writers and Community Publishers, which is a little organisation formed in the UK in '76. And what this article makes clear is that literacy is not the cognitive accomplishment of a solitary ego. It's a social practice linked to the formation of identity and the possibility of political agency. So I want to imagine information disinformation and religious literacy in that initiative that I've talked about in this pair of projects in these terms. That is, a sites and occasions for generating opportunities for critical self-reflection, transformation, and solidarity. In short, practice.
Thank you very much.